Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Remote Learning Toolkit, Learning and Leading in a Virtual World. This is our third webinar in our Remote Learning webinar series that's been brought to you by EdWeb and NetRef. I'm Emily Sumner, and I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm going to be your host, and I am joined on screen by our presenter, Carl Hooker, and that I know we're all looking very much forward to hearing shortly. So we appreciate everyone joining us today, and just want to thank you all for the extraordinary work you're doing to support students while they're at home during this time. You've all jumped in to continue to provide instruction and so much more to students at home. And so I hope that today's webinar provides you with some great new ideas, resources, and strategies that you can use as you continue this transition to remote and distance learning. And speaking of EdWeb, this is a wonderful professional learning opportunity, as you know. And so we'll encourage you to become a member of EdWeb. It's free to join and become a member specifically of the Digital World community. And that's where you'll find the archive of this webinar. Let's switch gears and meet Carl Hooker, who's been waiting so patiently here on camera. And I'll just give a quick introduction to who Carl is before he dives in. So during his 21 years in education, Carl Hooker has had a wide range of roles, from teacher and virtualization coordinator to director of innovation and digital learning at Eanes ISD in Texas, where he helped spearhead the launch of the LEAP program, which put one-to-one iPads in the hands of all K-12 students in this 8,000 student district. Most recently, Carl has authored a 6-part book series titled Mobile Learning Mindset, and he has another book in the works. In addition to his work as an author and district leader, Carl is a frequent keynote speaker and consultant. Previously in lots of in-person events like ISTE and TCEA, where you may have run across him, and now in lots of virtual events. He's been named a Tech and Learning Magazine's Leader of the Year and is a member of the Apple Distinguished Educator Class of 2013. He's also the host of the Learning Unleashed podcast, which is offered through ISTE and the BAM network. And if you haven't tuned into that past podcast, I really encourage you to do so. It is a great example of what you're going to see here today, which is Carl's unique blend of EdTech expertise and humor. So let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, well, thank you, Emily, so much for that introduction, and welcome to the thousands of you in the webinar as we speak. This is quite a trying time for all of us, and I will say that when we first talked about this topic, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago with the EdWeb team, it was definitely a different approach of what we were taking. So a lot of the information you're going to get during this webinar is very new, very up to date, and it's crowdsourced from districts across the country that I've been working with remotely. Just to kind of see what are the best resources out there when it comes to remote learning. Because let's face it, before we get started on this, I'm just going to say a lot of what we're doing is educational triage. We are trying our best to get learning to our kids. And there are amazing things that our teachers are doing all over this country. And so I want to start by saying thank you for the teachers and to the parents. And so some of you that are watching this may be someone who wears multiple hats. I do as well. So we'll hit a little bit on that as well. And let me see if I can get my slides to advance here. There we go. And again, as Emily mentioned, we're going to kind of continue the conversation at this hashtag remote learning tips. You'll see it at the bottom of the slides there. I'm kind of keeping an eye on it over in the left corner of my screen. And I've already posted the first question, which I'm going to get to right here. So there'll be kind of a slow chat taking place as well in the background if you want to kind of follow along and see what resources are posted there. But as Emily mentioned, if you are having some sort of audio video troubles with this the webinar, you can always refresh your browser or wait till after it's over today and you'll get the full recording to it, which will have a better quality sound to it if you're starting to have trouble with that. So hang in there if you can, but we're happy to see all of you remotely, or you see me, I can't see you. So let's start with this. I thought we'd reminisce before we get into the really heavy duty stuff, and let's talk about things we miss. And it could be a lot of different things. I'm going to say socially for me, I miss crowds. I was a big fan of going to music events. I love talking to crowds. As Emily mentioned, I'm a keynote speaker, which means a lot of keynotes that I've been doing lately have been coming straight from this office, not in front of a crowd where I can see a reaction, and I do miss that. So I miss that I'm not going to be able to hear you or see your reaction at all, but that's something I definitely miss. I don't really miss buffets that much, but yes, having potlucks, neighborhood get-togethers, those are things that I miss. Going to restaurants, bars, things where we can kind of converse with strangers, those are the things that I'm missing. Toilet paper, I'm really missing that right now because we're almost out of it here in Texas, it seems like. There's a guy right there that I caught walking out with the last 2 rolls the other day as I left the store, or I walked into the store, about to put my mask on there. And then shopping malls, which I don't really miss those, so I'll just kind of skip that. But you get the idea. So from things we miss to things we miss in schools. And this is a question that I actually posted just a couple of minutes ago on the remote learning tips hashtag. And that are, what are some things you're missing about school right now? And I see already from people that are responding in the chat, things like just missing the professional development, missing the interaction with the kids. For sure, I miss interacting with kids. One of the things I did as an administrator is I substitute teach every year for my own kids' classes. I have 3 little girls, and I like to come in and substitute teach. This is me with my daughter's 4th grade class last year doing a breakout EDU. And I think it's important for those of you administrators that are watching or listening to this webinar to think about that. Like, make sure that you're also doing some of the things that you're asking your teachers to do. And right now, what that looks like is you're helping lead some sort of virtual discussion. Maybe it's with your staff, maybe it's with the community, but make sure that you're also participating in this and you're not just kind of leaving that for the teachers. Make sure you're also modeling that as well. I think that's important to mention. I also miss the cafeterias, the smiling kids' faces, the field trips, the real ones. I mean, yes, we're taking some virtual field trips, and that's nice. And I know Monica mentioned some of those in the previous webinar 2 weeks ago. And there are some great resources for that, but I missed the actual field trips, getting out and experiencing those questions like we see here as my kids went on one of those. This is last year now. Miss standardized tests. I really actually no, I don't miss those. So we'll just skip that part. It will be interesting. I'll put this in here on purpose, though. It's going to be interesting to see how do we view assessment after this is all said and done. And that's kind of something we'll kind of get to in a minute, because assessing online and remotely is obviously a lot different. You can't really lock kids into their screens and assure with fidelity that what they're doing is exactly what they say they're going to be doing. So you have to really think about how do you assess kids differently during this time. So from things we missed in school, we'll kind of get into the meat of this discussion. And I'm really going to cover these main topics. And that is, we're going to talk about the power of communication, which I think is over and over again. It's super important now more than ever. And it was a problem and a bit of an issue in schools before in terms of that consistency. But now it's the only thing we have is that digital communication. And how do we relate that to our kids and our families? We'll hit on equity and access a little bit, another thing that's been highlighted by this pandemic. And then also the different type of learning that's happening in schools out there. Some of you may be experiencing synchronous learning where it's happening in real time. Some of you may be experiencing asynchronous where it's kind of like you have a week's worth of work to do and it's posted at the beginning of the week. So we'll talk about each of those quickly. And then tips and tools for video connection. Some of you have already experienced many of these, probably. If you've heard of Zoom bombing, we'll talk about that for just a minute. And so these are, again, things that we'll kind of go through throughout the webinar. I'll talk a little bit about a toolkit that I posted that's called the Beginner's Toolkit for Teaching Remotely. And it's really just kind of 5 basic tools of things that we just need to all kind of have in our wheelhouse when we're going out there and teaching remotely. Some of you have been doing this for a couple weeks by now, so you're probably thinking, oh, I've already got that part down, Carl, don't worry about it. But I'm hoping that you pick maybe 1 or 2 different ideas out of this webinar for you as well. And then lastly, for the parents in the group, or those of you that are also homeschooling your kids, we'll do kind of a quick run through of what that looks like in terms of like maybe some best practices, things you can do. Again, knowing every situation is different. I mean, in my house, I'm lucky my wife and I are both here, so we're kind of co-teaching. But I know not every one of you has that ability. You may have someone who's an essential worker that's going out, or you have all the kids to yourself, or maybe you have multiple kids that you're having to deal with different age levels. So we'll kind of hit as many of those as we can too. Again, generally as fast as we can in about a 50-minute-ish sprint through this webinar, and we'll leave a little bit of time for questions there at the end. By the way, I see some great things people are posting. Yeah, they miss their students. I see that over and over again. That seems to be a #1 thing that people are missing when it comes to that. And also missing senior years. My daughter's missing her 5th grade year. Not anywhere near as tragic as senior year, but I do see that. I have a lot of friends and a niece that is missing her senior year as well. So hang in there, guys. We're going to get through this. So let's start with this, the power of communication. And one of my good friends is Tom Murray. I don't know if you guys know him. Tom Murray has come. This is actually him speaking at our convocation. This would have been fall of 2019. And one of the things that he does when he talks around communication is, have you ever heard a song or a lyric of a song where you think it's saying something, but it actually, the real lyrics are something completely different? And he elicits this to kind of make you think, what is that? If you're hearing something different than what the artist wanted, what about the communities out there that you're communicating with? Are they hearing everything you want them to hear in that 20-bullet email that you've sent out? Maybe not. So some of the examples I like to go through, some of my favorite misheard song lyrics are like, excuse me while I kiss this guy. Not quite what Jimi Hendrix had in mind there. Dancing Queen, feel the beat from the tangerine. Well, yeah, I can't quite hit that note there, but you get the idea. And then, of course, one of my favorite is, and my kids actually think this is the real lyric in the song, is "Sweet dreams are made of cheese." Yes, not quite right. So we hear different things, even though that wasn't what was intended for us. And so when we think about that messaging and how we communicate these things to our kids, our communities and to our families, we got to really hit on that consistency part of it. And consistency looks like lots of different things. In my mind, it really hits different areas. So one I'll talk about first of all is the consistency in schedule, meaning when are you sending out certain types of communications? You see here, I kind of just listed a calendar here. Maybe you have school communications that come out on Thursday, kind of an email blast, or and then maybe teachers are sending out the weekly work on Monday. Trying to keep that as consistent as you can, knowing that things are definitely changing all the time is important. But that's something I feel like we can control no matter what kind of platform we're using. We can definitely control the time of which we're sending things out. And this is something that does take a coordinated effort. It's not just a group of teachers getting together and saying we're going to do it. It needs to be discussed with the administrator. It needs to be discussed with the school district if possible. Because I'll tell you, as a parent of 3 kids, I'm getting lots of information already. And if it's coming multiple times repeated throughout the day, I've heard from a lot of my peers and parents in the community that have said the same thing. It's almost overload. And we definitely want communication. But if it's overloaded, then it ends up getting lost in the shuffle. So consistency of schedule is important. Consistency in tools is something that maybe we don't all have the same controls over. I listed, the classic, of course, is telephone calls, leaving voicemail messages. Email is probably the go-to for most of us because that's something that we all know that we have. Although the danger of email is, of course, that again, it could get lost in the shuffle there. Some districts are using different tools, and these aren't tools that I'm associated with in any way. These are just tools I'm familiar with as a parent. Some of the teachers in my community are using things like Remind and Blooms to kind of send out just kind of a weekly announcement or message that doesn't necessarily hit our email inbox or our voicemail box. So again, consistency in tools is important. And if you have a district that is using multiple of these, it's going to add a little bit to the clutter in terms of what are we hearing in terms of those misheard song lyrics when it comes to learning. Make sure that it's consistent in terms of schedule, but also consistent in terms of the tool that's being used. So as a parent, I know on Monday, I go and I check Remind and there's the post for the week. Or on Thursday, I know that my email blast is coming from the district or the school office. So I'm going to kind of look at that as well, and I'll be ready for that. If you're doing too much of this, again, it gets kind of lost and it becomes kind of noise. The third thing I'll mention is consistency and expectations. And this goes a lot of different ways. It's a communication between the leader and the teachers, the leader and the parents, and what that looks like in terms of this is what we expect you to get from us. And as teachers, this is what I expect you to deliver also. Again, and we're not talking crazy expectations here because our teachers are also under a lot of stress right now. So I would think something along the lines of, please send out some sort of a weekly message just to your students. And it doesn't have to be something fancy like a video, although we'll talk about that in a little bit, how that does add a little more voice and personality to the communication. I do think it's important as leaders that we communicate, hey guys, this is kind of what we need to do to make sure that we're all doing this consistently and getting that communication out. I'll say it also goes between teacher and students and teacher and parents. I think that's important as well. The teacher needs to be communicating to the students, especially older students who are a little more self-sufficient. Here are the expectations of the work that I expect you to do. If it's part of a synchronous learning situation where they're actually learning on video, then it's the expectation of here's how I expect you to act during that video chat. Here are the questions I think that are appropriate, and then here's how we behave online appropriately. And then of course with parents, it's tricky because as parents, we want to help a lot. I do all the time. I'm guilty of this. I want to kind of be hovering over my kids, but at the same time, I need to give them the room and the grace to fail a little bit and recover and figure and learn through that, because it's through that struggle is where our kids are really learning. If we're doing all the work for our kids, they aren't really learning anything at this point. And honestly, it's only people in your house that know this. Your teacher is not going to be able to kind of view in and see what you're doing at all times with your kids. So it's going to kind of come up to you as a parent saying, okay, I'm going to give my kids some room to mess up, to struggle a little bit, but then also be there to help them recover and coach them through whatever it is that they're going through. And again, kids of different ages. I have a first, a second, and a fifth grader. It's going to look a lot different for me than it would be from a parent of a senior and a sophomore, perhaps. A lot different situation there. So again, those expectations will change based on who you have in your household. The other thing I would add is the fourth thing in terms of consistency is consistency in access. And what I mean by that is, I don't know about you guys, but in my situation here, we've got a lot of different platforms that our students can now access, which is great. Our school district has provided that. But one of the things that we noticed right away is that with each of those, there comes a different username or a different password or a different kind of a way of, maybe it's a browser preference that you have to use. And so with our own kids, they're struggling sometimes to figure out, okay, now how do I get that class code or that login? So one of the first things we did is we created a cheat sheet of student logins, and actually the school district provided kind of the basis of that, and we've kind of added a couple things to it. That way, as parents, but also as a school district, you're not getting inundated with requests for, oh, where's that login? Where's that access information? Can you just give me that in a single sheet? Again, be careful how you're sharing those, because this does have username and user information on it. So don't just send that out. Oh, here's a public Google link for everyone to look at. This should be information that's shared just between teacher and parent, or school and parent. And the other side of that is some districts are also providing things like a portal, which I think is a great idea too, where you go to a single portal, you log in as a student, and then you can see access to the different apps that you would use there. Either one of these, I think the important thing is to make sure there is some consistency in access, and however that happens, which kind of leads into the next category, which is equity in access. So not all of our students have access to the same things, and I think that's become very apparent during this time. We've seen a lot of schools kind of struggling or really rushing to the challenge of getting information and getting devices out to their kids. And these devices were kind of left in the schools in some cases, and schools were shut down over the weekends, and they were just sitting there kind of lonely, like this, like you see in this picture here. And IT staff have had to kind of scramble and figure out, how do we deploy these things? How do we get these things out and get them useful in our community? And how do we have parents that actually are able to access these as well? And I think that's just phase one. Schools that kind of had a one-up on this were the ones I think that were already sort of what you'd call a one-to-one program, or maybe a bring your own device program, where the students already had some sort of access. The one thing I would say for those of you that are out there trying to figure this out right now, I think when it comes to those same consistency and tools, we want to make sure that whatever we're doing, it's accessible on any device, because we don't know in a lot of cases what mom and dad have at home, and maybe it's only a single laptop, or maybe it's only a cell phone, or maybe it's only a tablet. And so you want to make sure as much as you can that you're giving that information out in an equitable way, that's saying, okay, here it is, go to this website, because the web is fairly universal. But again, not every parent or community out there will have access to these. So how are we getting those devices to our students? The other side of that, of course, is the internet itself. And believe it or not, in 2020, and some of you know this that are watching this, there's a lot of people out there that still don't have access to broadband internet. And that's really a kind of a sad testament when we think about what we've been providing for our kids over the last several years. The good news is I feel like this is highlighting that need, and it's really making us kind of rise to the occasion. So I've seen a variety of things from some school districts, including a local one here in Austin, has put Wi-Fi hotspots on their school buses and is driving them out to different points in the community, near parks and things like that. Of course, a lot of these parks are shut down, so you want to be careful where you're parking those buses. There is schools, this is actually in Seattle, where they've actually kind of connected to a Wi-Fi network that's on street poles to provide free Wi-Fi access to K-12 programs. You may know some local internet providers. I've talked to some friends in Maine and Boston and in the Illinois area who are doing the same thing, where they're working with their local internet provider like a Comcast or a Spectrum to provide that kind of K-12 resource. Some school districts are issuing hotspots, or maybe they have a 3G or 4G enabled device that they're actually sending out to their homes. And these are hotspots that the community can use, the parents can use in the household, that are actually run back through a district filter. And then, of course, there's other programs out there like Kajit, which I'll mention, which gives you some access. The one thing I'll say about the hotspots and the Kajit, and really all of these, is you're going to have some limitations on bandwidth, especially if you're doing synchronous learning with high-end video chat. Know that data is just going to eat up whatever you have access to there. So be wary of that, especially with students, and make sure that you make accommodations along that side. Just because they have access to the internet may mean that they don't have access to the high-quality internet that you would expect when it comes to, let's say, a video chat like we're doing right here. And then equitable access to schoolwork is also important. This is up the road for me, up in Waco. This is Waco High just recently. And you can see there, these are guys coming out. They're handing out bags of basically packets of schoolwork. And I know a lot of schools are doing this. And while we always say, and I'm even wearing a shirt that says straight out of worksheets here, I know we don't want to just teach worksheets, but giving kids access to some sort of work that they can get to. And just because they don't have internet or a device shouldn't mean that they shouldn't still continue to learn. So I have been very impressed with schools that have kind of scrambled for this as well, printed out little packets, kept them sealed, handed them out. Some schools are delivering these to homes using their transportation system, which I think is genius. Others using, like in this case, a car pickup at maybe one of the local high schools, and then trying to make sure that they're kind of keeping safe. This was a few weeks ago. If you saw this picture today, but all the people in this picture will be wearing masks at this point. As the state of Texas, we have a kind of a wear your mask order when it comes to getting this close proximity, and people like many of you are experiencing out there as well. And that kind of gets to this next part. So with a worksheet packet, that's going to be obviously something that you can't do synchronous. It's not going to be done in real time. You're not going to have a teacher kind of hovering over you and asking you those just-in-time questions. That's asynchronous learning. So when it comes to these two learning types, and there will be a question that pops up on the chat in just a minute, what kind of learning type are you experiencing as a parent? Also, as an educator, what kind of learning are you giving to your students? Is it synchronous, where the student is getting access to you at a certain time of day? Here are several pros to that. There are some good things that come of this. It's really good for virtual office hours, and those are those kind of just-in-time moments. My daughter today, actually, her second grade teacher, she has a 504, and she needs some help with dyslexia. Her teacher is actually meeting with her twice a week to kind of give her 15 to 20 minutes of some direct instruction there to help her through those challenges. And it was something I think that you, as a parent, if you're out there listening, to make sure you're advocating for that and you're asking for it. I think as teachers, we're more than happy to kind of make that in our schedule, but also know that teachers have a lot of students they're getting to. So if you are doing synchronous, it could be something where you're going to meet with a small group or your entire class, or even just one-on-one time through those office hours. Like, again, good for that one-on-one and small group instruction. It does keep the kids on a consistent schedule. Like, get up at 9 o'clock. You're going to have your math class on Mondays. I see a lot of schools that have like 8-period days, kind of doing alternate days, which I think is good too, because you're not saying we're going to cram 8 hours of time staring at a screen. You're going to actually have 4 class periods on Monday and then maybe 4 class periods on Tuesday. I kind of like that staggered approach as well. Again, the just-in-time support and feedback is valuable, and I think having a teacher right there that you can ask a question to if you don't understand something is important. That's a big pro of doing synchronous learning. And it does kind of help continue the classroom community feel. My first grade daughter was on her first kind of class chat just on Friday, and the smile on her face, y'all, it warmed my heart just to see her friends, even though she only said a couple of things, just to see her teacher, see her friends. And it kind of keeps that idea, that classroom community feel. And I think that's a big pro of that synchronous instruction. Now, with everything, there's cons of this as well. And so those of you that are experiencing this right now, you probably know, of course, one of the things is that, as I mentioned earlier, you have to really be relying on that good internet access. And I think that's something that we've taken for granted. But even now with video chats, I mean, even this webinar where we kind of got capped out at a certain time, we have to make sure that the information is getting across. We did have a situation last week where we've had some teachers that their chat was not very good. Their internet at their home wasn't very good. And so it was really choppy. And for the students that were really struggling listening to that, what I would say for those of you that are out there doing this, when it comes to the difference between video and audio, I would select have good quality audio over video. Even if that means just putting a static image of your face on the screen, it'll actually help reduce some of those internet lags. I think it's important for kids to hear your voice and hear the quality of the instructions that are being given versus just seeing a kind of a staggered frozen picture that you can barely understand. So think about that, choosing good audio over good video. I will say video conferencing tools can be intimidating. A lot of our teachers out there were just thrown into this, and so they're having to kind of figure out Zoom and Google Hangout, WebEx, things like that. And a lot of times that's where mistakes can happen, and we've already seen it. As I mentioned earlier, the Zoom bombing things where you just kind of send out a link and then people have access to it. It also assumes quite a bit that all students have access to a device at a certain time of day. It's one thing for a family to say, oh, we have a laptop in our house that we can use. But I'm working with a school district outside of Atlanta, and one of the things they told me was that one of their families actually has 8 school-age children in their house, and they only have one device. So in that case, how are they deciding who's going to have access to that device to be a part of that chat or that video instruction? So again, if you are doing this, I'm hoping that some of you are recording this and capturing it and figuring out a way to get it back out to the students that may not have access at certain times. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it can result in a lot more screen time. It's where kids are kind of sitting on a computer watching that screen all day if they're kind of going through their school day. So there's a bit of a pro-con there, making sure you have some sort of breaks or maybe lightening the schedule a little bit, like I mentioned earlier, staggering that schedule instead of a full school day. It's a lot different on a screen than it is, of course, face-to-face. Now, the flip side of that, we have asynchronous instruction, and there are a lot of pros to this as well, and that's that there's a lot of flexible time to process and complete student work. And in this situation, what I'm thinking of when I think of flexible and that asynchronous learning, teacher delivers maybe it's a packet of information or a choice sheet or something either at the beginning of the day or the beginning of the week. And the student's job is to kind of get through the tasks, get through the challenges, log into the certain websites and kind of complete the work throughout the week. So there is some expectations there, but the students have time to kind of build in that schedule. It does allow more time for reflection. That's one of the negatives I would say of synchronous video chat is that when someone's talking at you like I am right now, you may not have chance to really sit there and process like, okay, what was I thinking when he asked that question? How can I ask it? You lose that because it's kind of coming at you so fast. And that's really why, like in our case, I'm trying to model this by having an asynchronous discussion happening on Twitter while I'm having a synchronous chat with you guys. So there's an opportunity for us to interact, and I'll go back through and follow up with those later as well. And again, it doesn't require really high bandwidth. In fact, in a lot of cases, like I mentioned, like showed you the pictures of Waco High, a lot of that is you don't even need internet. It's just here's the information of work you have to do, get through the work as you can, and then figure out some way to collect that at the end of the year or the end of the week. A lot of times it doesn't require you to have like this amazing internet in your house as well. And I do like that students get to set their own pace, and that means a lot of different things. So if you have a student like one of my children, one of them just absolutely just flies with math, and so what she likes to do is she likes to get most of her math done on Monday. And as a parent, I at first was like, well, no, you have to do math, this part of the day every single day. No, you don't. You can really be a lot more flexible and kind of go with those teachable moments when you're having an asynchronous schedule where you could say, all right, kids, your job is really to complete this work. How can you get this work done throughout the week? And it allows them to have a little more autonomy, which I kind of like in terms of asynchronous instruction. And again, convenient access to the materials also to set those goals. And I think that's an important part of this as well. Now, there is a flip side to asynchronous as well. I'm not going to say that either one of these is right or wrong. And those of you that are watching on this chat, there may be some of you are thinking in your head, well, I'd really like to use more asynchronous. You can actually piecemeal a little bit of both. And I think some schools are really hitting that sweet spot of here are some information for the week. But also, I'm going to step in at these times throughout the week and have conversations. I really like that kind of blended approach when it comes to synchronous and asynchronous. So don't feel like it's an either or conversation. I think it can be a yes and. Here are some cons, though, that I just want you to be aware of. Feedback and troubleshooting can take a lot more time. So in the case of a synchronous situation where I'm on a video chat with the teacher, I can immediately ask, hey, I'm not sure what you're talking about. Can you repeat these instructions? I'm not quite sure what you're thinking there. Versus when it's asynchronous, it may be Monday, Wednesday, Thursday before your student gets to a certain part of it. And then they're figuring out, well, how do I get access to this? Or they have a question about the instructions. Your instructions have to be really clear and clean. In that case, it's not just like saying, go to this website and click on this link. You really need to provide that. So that could be a little bit trickier. You'll see a lot more questions coming back to teachers that are doing asynchronous learning right now. Confidentiality and efficacy of work. I mentioned that with the testing, it can be a little bit challenging because in theory, we don't know who's doing the work. And I think with synchronous, you can be sitting there watching the student on the screen. Maybe they're interacting with you. You can kind of tell and see if they're the ones actually doing the work versus asynchronous, where it could be mom and dad helping with the work, an older brother, older sister, somebody helping them with the work. And you're not really quite sure, are they actually doing the work that you've been asking them to do? So that's a challenge. And again, a lesser feeling of that classroom community. I mean, really, at this point, the community, the classroom community is just what's happening in the house. There's not really an interaction with other students or with the teacher when it's asynchronous. You're just kind of getting a list at the beginning of the week and kind of going through that. So again, pros and cons of both synchronous and asynchronous learning. And I see a lot of you out there posted just some questions about this. Actually, I just posted a question about a few minutes ago on the remote learning tips hashtag. And again, that hashtag is at the bottom of the screen there. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about when I talk about that hashtag, it's hashtag remote learning tips. I posted a few of these questions, and I see a lot of you giving really good feedback about whether or not which one is better or worse. And again, it seems like kind of a blended approach seems to be the sweet spot for that. So next we'll get into kind of this next category of tips and tools for video connection. So if you do have some sort of synchronous or even asynchronous, there is a way to use video as a powerful tool. And I think one thing I'll mention is there's lots of different tools out there. And I'm not going to advocate for any one of these over another. I mean, I didn't even list, and I noticed right now I didn't even list Google Hangout on this list, but there's lots of different tools. The one thing I will say, if you're a teacher watching this podcast or this webinar and you've thought about this, be sure that you're checking with IT departments. Be sure you're checking with your administration. There may be a preferred method that your school is wanting to use, and you probably already got that. But if you're not sure, I would definitely reach out to an administrator to make sure that you're doing everything kind of on the up and up. Some of these, there's data, there's issues you got to worry about in terms of student privacy. So making sure that all of that and all those logins go through the appropriate channels, I think is important. And then the flip side of that is asynchronous. There's lots of different tools you can use. These are ones that I see quite a bit, especially with my kiddos, the elementary age kids. Seesaw is a tool that I see a lot of teachers using out there, and it allows you to embed those video instructions onto the actual whatever the assignment is, which I really like because it adds kind of a layer of teacher voice. So if my first grader has a question about something, she watches the video of the teacher who kind of goes through the rules and kind of what the instructions are for that assignment, and maybe post a couple of clarifying points at that point as well. And then, of course, Flipgrid, which is a great another free tool that a lot of teachers are using to kind of keep that classroom community feel. It's not as bandwidth intensive because, again, students can get on there at any time and post a video. You really just need some sort of phone with a camera. You don't need fancy software or anything like that. So that's the one advantage I would say of those tools. They're very mobile friendly, which I think is something that we have to kind of assume our students aren't going to have access to a beautiful computer system at their homes. Everybody's got a little bit of a different level of access there. So those are good asynchronous video tools. A lot of you are probably already utilizing these in different ways. And if you want to post those at that remote learning tips, ways you're using video tools, I'd be curious to hear what you as a community are using. Most of the resources I'm getting are coming from schools that I've worked with, again, kind of throughout the country. And so I've heard some of the pros and cons to a lot of these. One of the things I would say about video connection tips, and we've already seen some of these out there on the web. You don't want to become a meme. That's kind of a good goal as a teacher, is not to become a meme in your lifetime. So make sure you're dressing appropriately as much as you can. I mean, it's one thing to wear shorts on underneath, but appropriate dress I think is important. If you can at all limit interruptions, I get this is again challenging. We don't have these not everyone has access to like a little sound booth in their house. It may be that you're outside while your kids are inside, or vice versa, or if you have pets or things like that. You can't control when someone's going to show up at your doorstep. But as much as you can, try to limit those interruptions, because it does get you off track when it comes to what you're trying to do with your kiddos. Check your security settings. I mentioned it now. This is the third time I've mentioned this, but the Zoom bombing stuff is real, y'all. And I think they've made some changes at Zoom particularly, but every platform that you use has different protocols when it comes to this. So be thinking about, is there a meeting password? That's kind of a best practice to make sure there's some sort of password that students need to log in. Make sure there's some sort of waiting room or some sort of queue, so you don't just have random people coming in there, people that you can kick out, and you have control over that. Be careful with your controls. Make sure that you are only allowing yourself to kind of share the screen. And I think by default on a lot of these platforms now, mute is the default option when they come on. I know with Zoom and Google Classroom, Google Hangout, that is one of the things that they do. They kind of, you come in and you're muted right away. Make sure you still have some of that power of control of that. Disable private chat. I think again, you're going to have to kind of play this one by ear. I think one thing you want to do is make sure that you're having kind of awareness of what you're doing. If you're hosting a video learning opportunity for your kids, this isn't a time for them to kind of be having little side conversations about funny things they're doing. They can do that on their own. And believe me, I know kids, especially teenagers, are really wanting to get out of their house and have some side conversation. I would just encourage you as a teacher to say, that's awesome. Have that side conversation after class is over. This is a learning time. This isn't the time to just socialize. Although again, as a teacher, if you're really thinking about what you're doing with your kids, make sure that you do build in a little bit of time to socialize and just check in and see what they're doing. Don't just turn on the video chat and say, all right, we're getting right to work. Make sure you're allowing some of that time to support also those kind of SEL building skills. Then, of course, locking in a meeting if it gets kind of like to where you feel like there's some way that people are getting access to it they shouldn't be, making sure you have the ability to lock that in. A couple other things. Again, this varies based on what kind of method you're using. I would say synchronous. If you can, limit it to an hour. I think staying online for more than that for kids, it's a lot for them to process, even if they are kind of having interactions and conversations. Asynchronous, I try to limit it to 5 to 10 minutes. I put out some videos, and I'll share those resources with all of you after this chat is posted. I'll send these out to you, but I've actually started a list of a video series called Remote Hacks. And in those videos, I try to keep them to about 5 minutes, because I feel like as adults or as students, we only have a limited amount of time when it comes to listening and processing that information. If you do these 40-minute long lectures, it's really going to be hard for kids to kind of focus and follow along with that unless you have built-in times for them to kind of take those pauses. And then, of course, as I mentioned a couple times, check your student privacy, check the parental consent. Some parents may not be comfortable with this, putting their kids on a video chat. Be careful when it comes to, if you get excited, I do all the time when I see my kids kind of on a video chat with their classmates and I see them smiling. What I try to make sure to not do is go around and like take a picture of the kids on the screen, because again, taking pictures of kids on the screen and then posting that online, depending on the age of the kids, there's a lot of little issues there you got to kind of be aware of. So again, be concerned, or at least be aware of your student privacy rules, and also that parental consent, making sure parents, mom and dad, have given that permission. That's something we had to do for our kids before they even had access to the link for the video chat in their classroom. And we got two more kind of big categories to get to, and it looks like we're doing pretty good on time. I'm kind of looking over now, and actually I just posted a question on the remote learning tips again. Question 4 was, what are some tips you guys have when it comes to video chats? What are some best practices? What are some things to avoid? And I think that's important to think about too. And someone also mentioned in that chat on remote learning tips that there is that classroom community and SEL is so important. And I think I kind of went over it quickly there in that last segment, but let me not dismiss that. I think teachers, those of you that are out there watching this, start with that. Start with how am I supporting you? How can I help you? What is going on in your household? And we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like here in a second, but I think it's important to really address that right away before you get too heavy into that learning. So when it comes to beginner's toolkit for teachers, again, this sounds repetitive, and it is, but make sure you're consistent with the communication. Like I mentioned before, sending things out on a single platform that teachers and parents and students have access to, and then also making sure that's happening at a consistent time throughout the week. Um, Going back to what I was just saying, make sure you're supporting the student needs before you are going into academics. They've lost a lot with this. A lot of students are confused. A lot of their households are kind of in a disruptive mode. I think a good friend, Dean Sharesky, who's on Twitter at Sharesky, said this first, and he said, make sure you're taking Maslow's over Bloom's. So in other words, let's make sure our students have that safety and that love and belonging and that esteem before they can really start getting to the self-actualization part, which is the creating and the evaluating and all the things we see in Bloom's. So we have to make sure we allow some edge of grace there when it comes to allowing our kids to have the opportunity to share, to have access to the learning that we're giving them, but also don't set the expectations so harshly that that it's actually becoming a very negative moment. I think we can learn a lot through this, and I think there's some things we can learn from it. But if you're not taking into account the students' needs before you get into the academic part, I think it's going to be a real challenge as a teacher to really get your kids to kind of learn and be motivated to learn in that sense. As I mentioned before, being available is one of the best things you can do. We are lucky; all of our daughters' teachers have had very good access. They've responded to us well. A lot of them are working on plans for the week, and then they have what they've said as office hours where they're available. But as a teacher, make sure that you're also communicating that to the parents, so we're aware too. So we're not going to be hitting you up if we hit you up for an email at 11 o'clock at night. We should know, maybe it's a feedback response or an auto response that says I will be available between these hours. You as a teacher also need a life, and you need to make sure that you're giving yourself breaks and you're taking care of your own Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So take those breaks as you need it, and also make sure you're communicating that to parents. We are very much understanding of that as well. And even though sometimes we may be like, oh, we're not sure what's happening with our kids, can you please help? We know that you're also humans, and you should take time to communicate that back to us. So just make sure that you're communicating that out to parents when you're available, and also for the students. Again, clear expectations for content delivery and retrieval. There's all these different platforms out there, from email, Microsoft Teams, Blackboard, LMSs like Google Classroom, Schoology, Canvas, Google Drive, lots of different things. Some of the ones I didn't even list on here that your school may be using. The only thing I would say over and over again, and I said it at the very beginning when I talked about communication, it's the same when it comes to content. Try to keep it in a single space if you can. If parents and students are having to look everywhere for the information, that's going to be a real problem, because if it takes us more time to find the information than it does to actually get to the work, then there's going to be a lot of struggle and a lot of frustration at home with that. And there's not going to be as much learning taking place. So as much as you can ease up on that by saying, hey guys, it's going to be at the same spot, you know where to get it. It's going to be in Google Classroom, or it's going to be in Canvas or whatever. Or even here's an email attachment or a packet that we sent home physically. That's where you're going to get that information. As long as that part stays consistent, I think you'll see that there's a lot less stress when it comes to actually getting the work done. And then again, at the end, make sure that you have that time for feedback and reflection. It doesn't matter what method you're doing, by the way. If you're doing asynchronous or synchronous, if you can build this in, I think it's a powerful thing. I've seen teachers do this. There's a community district, I want to say up in the Massachusetts area, that was doing this, where as a teacher, I saw her, she was a fourth grade teacher. And one of the things she did is she had kind of what she called a soft open to her class. And so she launches the video chat, and then immediately it's like, let's have a little bit of social time. Let's talk a little bit about what we've been doing, what we're kind of up to, have some chats, some conversations. And then at the end of her quote unquote instructional time, she's then saying, all right, guys, I want you each to think about for just a minute. And she would even pause for a minute and not say a word, and just say, I want you to, for 1 minute, I'm going to put a clock up here, and we're going to sit here and think about, and let's have a little bit of time to reflect on, first of all, what's happening in our lives at this time, but also what are some things that we've learned and things that we were trying to learn, and what questions we might have. And giving your kids that opportunity to pause and give that reflection can also lead to really good high quality feedback. So again, it doesn't matter if you're doing it synchronous or asynchronous. I think any way you can build in a little bit of reflection and that opportunity for feedback, I think is just important to make the learning a lot better for your kids. Because unlike the classroom, when we can walk around and you can really kind of sense, like, oh, I know that little Johnny there is really struggling with this, because I can kind of tell he's getting out of control. He's starting to act up a little bit, or maybe Mary's, you can tell she's kind of got a absent-minded view on her face and she's not really sure what she's doing. You don't have that opportunity as much now as an educator. So anytime you can help them build in those tools and help them have that autonomy to say, I'm struggling here and I can tell that I am, here's some things I need to think about, and here's some ways I need to give that feedback, I think is important. And then we're going to get to this last section here, and I'm just going to kind of glance over again and look at see how we're doing on our chat. And it looks like, yeah, it's come up a couple times, and we mentioned equity earlier, and I think that is something that can be easily overlooked when it comes to student video. And I said it before, but again, be very considerate of that. I do love, someone mentioned on here that I didn't mention, and that's virtual backgrounds, which I think are kind of a neat idea too. If you are doing those virtual chats or virtual videos, or even if you're doing this asynchronous videos where you're recording something in advance, there are a lot of the tools now offer some sort of green screen or background chat. And one of the teachers I know is a middle school teacher. Her name is Kathy on Twitter, Kathy Yanka. And one of the things she did is she happened to have a picture of her classroom just kind of empty. And she uses that photo as her background. And so whenever she's talking to her students, it's kind of nice because it allows them to kind of say, oh yeah, there's our classroom, even though we're not in there and there's empty desks, it gives you that little bit of look and feel, which I thought was kind of a neat little hack when it comes to kind of letting kids feel at least a little bit more part of that community. I think that's important to know too. And then again, someone else mentioned too on the chat there, like look at that auto reply, make sure you're aware of that, and make sure that you're communicating that to your students and to the parents to say like, hey, if you get an auto reply, it's not because I'm ignoring you, it's because there's certain times of day that I can get access to it. I want you to be patient. I'll get back to you. And a lot of times teachers are willing to do that pretty quickly within a 24-hour period. So I think that's important to also enable too. So now we get to the parent side of this, and I don't know about those of you that are watching, but a lot of us at home right now are also teaching our kids, and we're become teachers. And it's funny, I taught first grade, I taught fifth grade. As I mentioned earlier, I substitute teach all the time, or I used to all the time when we were in school. And I think every kid is different, and every grade level is absolutely different. And so for those of you that are dealing with multiple kids, or even a single kid that's just trying to struggle with this, there's lots of tips that I'm going to relay real quickly to you here. But know that if you are an educator without kids at home, these are just some things you have to think about when you're actually sending things back to your to the parents that are out there to receiving this information. And that is, again, number one is make sure you have that grace and patience as parents. We are all going through different things. Some of us are working remotely from home, like I am. Some of us are trying to figure out when our next paycheck is coming, and so there's a lot of stress in our house and all the houses across the United States right now and across the world. And I think we have to make sure that we allow ourselves to have some grace and some patience when it comes to teaching our kids. And that means giving them some opportunities to struggle, as I mentioned earlier, but also having opportunities for yourself to take breaks throughout that time. I do think this is this was actually something that someone sent to me, but I've honestly done this before. I'm like, Alexa, please homeschool the children. Give me some help over here. We're all kind of figuring this out, and I think it's funny, even as someone who's been an educator for over 20 years and as a classroom teacher, it's different when you're teaching your own kids. A lot of you are probably nodding your heads right now going, yes, I sometimes send my kids to school and think, how did you get them to learn? And so one thing that I would recommend again is make sure you're asking for help. A lot of teachers out there are willing to give you a little assistance when it comes to strategies that they use with your kids that you may not even know they use. They just employ those right away, those just-in-time things that they do in the classroom. So be sure to ask for those assistance. Like, hey, my kid is really struggling with this subject. Do you have any tips or advice? Teachers are more than welcome to offer that. And again, if you're a teacher watching this, be thinking of those too and saying, hey guys, here's just a few tips that you might be able to use, a little toolkit for parents to use at home, because not all parents have an educator background and they're just kind of figuring this out as they go. So as much as that we can send home is important. Parents, monitoring screen time, I think was kind of the original topic of this entire talk when we first started. A lot of that honestly flew out the window when this happened, because we're kind of like, as parents, like, here, you need this device to get your work done, but also you need this device to keep you distracted so I can actually get work done. I will say that even though we are doing a lot of learning on screens, some of us are, be cognizant of your kids. And this is something I would have said in the chat before we changed it to the topic that we're doing today. And that is, each kid is different. And so each of your, this, if you have kids at home, a lot of them react differently when they're on screens. And some of them may get frustrated quickly or easily. So making sure that you're building in those breaks and using tools at your disposal. A lot of both Android and iOS have built-in kind of screen monitoring tools. And if you're not sure, I can send you some of those as well. I'll send out some of these when I do a follow-up email with the group. But those are a lot of tools out there that you can have access to. So just keep an eye on that. I would say have as flexible a schedule as possible. I'm being very transparent here. Here is my schedule. You can see it on the screen. So we it looks pretty rigid because we have these kind of time bands of when there's actually physical activity, AM learning time. It looks like we're perfect parents. We are not. We are far from it. But what we do is we needed some sort of semblance of a schedule for not only ourselves but also for our kids, so that they're aware of, like, okay, I have some time in the morning when I need to get some of my learning done, but also in the afternoon. And then building in times for breaks, building in individual quiet time. I mean, that's an important part of it too, making sure you're giving yourself a break. And then on the right, you can kind of see there, we as administrators of our homeschool, my wife and I decided that we were going to take Wednesdays off. And so what we've done is we've kind of built the schedule around a 4-day week. We have our kids get through as much stuff as they can, and we're doing mostly, as I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned this before, we're doing mostly asynchronous at home, with some synchronous blended in with some class meetings. But we're giving ourselves that kind of leeway of saying Wednesday is going to be an off day. It gives us a pause and a break, but it also gives our kids a pause and a break. We build in some creative things for them, but it also gives us an opportunity to kind of take a breath and then go to the next 2 days. And so it's a nice split for us, and it may work for you as well. One thing I would say is, if at all possible, and this is hard if you're doing synchronous learning because you may have to go longer than 3 hours, try to limit those chunks of academic time to 3 hours. Meaning, if you have a morning chunk that starts at 9, try to make sure you're not going past noon. Don't say 9 to like 4 o'clock in the afternoon to just sit there and be doing academic work. Have in some time for brain breaks. This goes for kids of all ages. And by the way, adults of all ages when it comes to brain breaks. I don't know if you guys know this, but the average amount of time that a student can go kind of watching or being a part of an active kind of a lecture is about the average of their age. So you take a 5-year-old, those of you that have kindergartners out there, you have about this many minutes, 5 minutes of time to keep their attention. And you've probably already experienced this at your home before they're kind of off doing other things. So you have to make sure you're breaking things up into those small chunks throughout your day. And by the way, for adults, it's about 18 to 20 minutes. So don't feel like we're much better. We can go about 18 to 20 minutes. The fact that we've been on this webinar now for 40 minutes, 50 minutes makes me nervous. Some of you have probably already taken breaks. You've stepped aside for a minute. You looked at the chat, kind of followed up. So having in those breaks is important as well. In this case, since I'm trying to get so much information out to you, I haven't built in a break. But a lot of times, if you've ever seen me live or on stage, I do the same thing. We take a break in the middle of even a keynote, and we do a little bit of interactive brain break for that too. Have some built-in time for creativity and fun. I think that's important. These are all 3 of my kids. You can see they're all kind of doing different things. One loves video, one loves playing board games like crazy. The oldest, is all of a sudden taking on this challenge of wanting to be a chef. The 5th grader wants to be a chef. This came out of the blue just as a result of this pandemic. So who knows what happens with her career now. But one of the things that's great is that she's actually taken more ownership in terms of things that are happening in our house. And for some of you, this may have already been happening before this. For us, it was a great opportunity. She had the interest. And I would say that what comes with all of this, we want to have that flexibility in there for those teachable moments. Don't be so rigid that if you're out on a walk with your kids or you're out in the community and you're saying, okay, we're going to go on a nature walk today. If you come across something that's interesting to your kids, say, hey, let's look at that. Let's research it. Spend a little bit of time researching that. That's just in time learning. Classroom teachers do this all the time when you're sitting there going, all right, we have 90 minutes of math. But if something's happening and the kids are really engaged in it, a lot of times as a teacher, I did this all the time, you'll expand a little bit on that learning time. Really stick with that, because motivation and focus is an important part. And you want to see if they're motivated for something, continue down that path as much as you can. So make sure you build in that time as well. And then one last tip for parents, and this kind of wraps it up here in a minute, and that is, when it comes to motivation, there's lots of different tools and strategies you can use with older kids. I have some friends that have teenage kids, and what they've done is they kind of give them some bonus time, whether it be bonus time for them to have extra gaming time. Maybe it's they get to choose the menu for the night, which I think a lot of kids like to say, yes, I would like to choose what we're eating tonight. Giving them some little perks to make sure that they're getting through their day. And you could fall on any side of the argument when it comes to extrinsic and intrinsic rewards. We won't get into that, but I think that having some sort of goal for them is important, and setting those goals for our own kids. You can see here on the slide, one thing we did was what's called the bedtime bonus. And again, this is in theory works out perfectly every time, but sometimes we have to adjust it. The idea is that if our kids get through whatever work that we've kind of set with them, we kind of meet with them in the morning, set their goals. If they get through their goals without much arguing or fighting with each other or the teachers, meaning us, that they get a little 1 hour bonus time at the end of the day to stay up a little bit later. Again, we now have some flexibility in our schedule that we didn't have before, so let's take advantage of that. We use that bonus time to do something fun as a family, maybe to play a board game. They've really gotten into shows like Survivor, so we started watching back episodes of that and just having kind of a family bonding time around that. I think that's a good thing to kind of make up for that. So having that little reward at the end of the day has really helped as a parent. So there's kind of all the things. We hit them pretty quickly. Again, right on point. We've got about 9 minutes left. I'll kind of go through these last couple things with you. And again, encourage you, if you have questions, there's the remote learning tips hashtag. We hit all these fairly quickly. We spent a little more time on some than others. If you want to connect with me before, if you have to step out here in a minute and you don't get a chance to get your question asked, I am widely available on all these platforms. So Twitter is probably recommended number one. That's at Mr. Hooker, and I'm kind of monitoring that right now as we're looking. Of course, again, the hashtag at the bottom. I'll go back through as much as I can and answer some questions that people have posted in there. There's Instagram, my direct email. If you just want to ask a question on email, there's carl@hookertech.com. Facebook, my website, and then my blog, all on there as well. So I'll be sending out some follow-up resources, and I want to thank EdWeb and NetRef for really giving us the opportunity to have this conversation discussion. I think it's one that obviously it's been needing to happen, and we're kind of in catch-up mode. A lot of us are right now, and I will say again, make sure you guys give yourselves a little bit of grace when it comes to all this. So please continue the conversation at that hashtag remote learning tips. And with that, I'll kick it back to Emily.
Great. Thank you so much, Carl. This time flew by in spite of your your good advice that we need brain breaks. I really didn't need one in this because you
A lot.
great information and kept me on my toes. So thank you very much for being with us today and going through all of this. And folks, you will get access to the recording and the slide deck. I know we went quickly through this. We wanted to get in as much valuable information as we could in the short amount of time we had together. So just keep an eye on your email for a link to the recording, and you can also log into your EdWeb account to get that information. Before we get to our questions, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can, I did want to once again thank NetRef as our sponsor of this webinar. They brought Carl to you today. And NetRef is a classroom and device management solution that helps ensure students stay focused on learning, whether they're using devices in the classroom or outside of the classroom. So even while students are learning at home, teachers can choose websites and apps that they want to push to students on their devices, and they can also monitor the learning that's going on. So it's a really useful tool. And in this time of transitioning to remote learning and dealing with everything that was put upon us so quickly, NetRef is offering use of the platform at absolutely no cost through June 30th. So to hopefully get you through the rest of this school year. So you can visit net-ref.com and you'll see a pop-up at the top of the website with a link you can click on to learn more about their solution and how to use it for at-home learning, and also how to get in touch with someone about taking advantage of that offer that, again, is free usage through June 30th. So I encourage you to check that out. I also encourage you to go to the website because the webinar that Carl referenced with Dr. Monica Burns that we held 2 weeks ago is hosted on the NetRef website, as well as one we had with Dr. Justin Alio, who joined us from a Pennsylvania school district on March 31st, and he was also talking about remote and distance learning strategies. So those resources and more are on the NetRef website. So let's go ahead and get to some questions. One question that we got from a lot of people, and it was on Twitter as well. Do you have some suggestions, Carl, for how to try to engage parents? When you're sending emails, you're sending things home, and you're just getting no interaction from parents, do you have some suggestions to try to get some communication going there?
Yeah, I think the important thing to know is that whatever communication you're sending home, keep it as brief as possible. So if you're seeing that you're not getting a lot of responses from parents, it may be check to make sure that you're not sending home a long list of things to do. Maybe it's something as simple as, hey, there's a quick little tip I would love to share with you. Can you reach out to me? A single question or a single type of a one-line type response. Because a lot of times if parents are inundated, they open up that email, and if they see a long list of things, they're probably going to pause on it or push it back or defer it to later, and then maybe they won't get to it. So I would say try to keep it as brief as possible. If you have some access to the phone system, I know a lot of schools have those automated calls. I mean, even dropping in a voicemail message out to them that just says, hey, we're here for you. Here's a couple of ways you can get in touch with us. Any way you can to get in touch with them, I would say keep that part as streamlined as possible. So two things really, and that is making sure that you're not doing some sort of complicated tool when it comes to that engagement. So if you're someone who posts on one of the sites I mentioned, like Blooms or Remind or something, and you're not seeing anything, it might be that the parent just hasn't gone through the trouble of downloading the app because they're just overwhelmed at this point. So email, phone call, that may just be your method of communication. And then the second thing, like I said, keep it as brief as you can just to get some sort of response, a yes, no, something, just to make sure that everyone's okay. I think that's your first step. And if you can get that, then you can try to build on that as much as you can.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think sometimes variety of channels can help too.
Yeah.
So email, text, out on your learning management platform, give parents a couple different options to try to connect. But I
I,
do know that's a challenge because, as you said, so many parents are overwhelmed and very stressed out right now. So
and a lot of them are on social media, and I wouldn't advocate for a particular platform over another. I do have a really good friend who's an art teacher who's been doing a live kind of a art tutorial every day on Facebook. He just does a Facebook live thing, and it's been neat for him because he's told me he's gotten a lot more traction with that. The parents are getting in there, they're having their kids watch him kind of go through the tutorials, and he's getting the little pop-up messages that come on Facebook Live that he said he wasn't getting through email, and he wasn't getting through when he was sending it out through his normal system. So yeah, you're right. I mean, sometimes you may have to go where they're at. And if they're on Facebook looking at the news and looking at their friends, pop up in there as much as you can too. Again, check with your schools because some schools there may be rules about that. So be careful with that.
right, yeah. So for the live video discussions, the more synchronous kind of instruction, do you have recommendations for how many kiddos to have on at one time? Should, if you have a large class of 25 or 30 kids, should you be splitting that into different sessions?
Yeah, if you can, yes, I would say I never would go more than 10 or 12, ideally, but we don't all have that kind of opportunity. With in my daughter's class, she's got two fifth grade teachers. They have a combined 58 kids.
Mm.
So for them, they do a morning and an afternoon session, and they try to push people to one or the other. But even then, 20 something kids, by the time you go through each single kid, and a lot of you are probably thinking, yeah, this is why I'm asking the question. When you go through each single kid to ask them a question, and you know how some kids maybe trying to figure out how to unmute their mic, or maybe they're thinking of a question, by the time you get through with it, it's an hour and you're already done with your class. So if at all possible, I would try to break it into a smaller group, even smaller than 10 or 12. I will say one of the neat things, and this is, I don't know how long this has been around with Zoom particularly, but I know it's one of the platforms that lets you do the kind of the breakout rooms where you can have kids group in groups of 3 or 4, and then you as kind of teacher can go in and monitor each of those groups. I think that's important to kind of, as you start to feel comfortable with it, get to that next stage, say, all right, guys, I'm going to ask you all a question, and now I'm going to send you to little breakouts and put a little timer on it and say, all right, you have 5 minutes to have this discussion, and you can kind of jump in, and then maybe have one student kind of report back and say, oh, this is one of our takeaways from that, and have kind of a person that's a spokesperson for it. That way you're at least getting them to be a little more engaged. But it is hard when and you may not have that opportunity, but if you have 28 to 30 kids, I don't know how some teachers do it. That's a lot of kids to manage in a video chat. It's a lot to manage in a classroom, but
Yeah.
at least you have some physical proximity. Here we don't. So
Yeah, the breakout rooms are a great idea, and it sort of simulates that small group instruction a little bit. But yeah, it does take some getting used to jumping between those rooms and monitoring all that. So we are coming up against the end of our time, unfortunately. But thank you again, Carl, for being here with us. And thank you again to NetRef for sponsoring the webinar. Again, I encourage you to go to net-ref.com to view the past 3 webinars in this remote learning series and to learn more about that free offer of using the platform through June 30th. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for all your hard work as you continue to try to meet the needs of your students and their families in these difficult times. I know we've all learned a lot from Carl, and we'll be able to put that into practice bright and early tomorrow when we're back online with our students. So thanks a lot, everybody, and have a great afternoon.